Hey there, can you believe that we have finally arrived at week 5? I can barely believe it. I'm super excited to talk about the book with you this week because a lot of interesting things happen. Oh my goodness. Some really exciting things, some unexpected things. So let's dive in. So this week starts out with Jane being summoned to her old home where she lived with her aunt and uncle and her cousins. And she's being summoned because apparently her cousin has passed and her aunt is really not doing too well and wanted to speak with Jane one last time before she also passed. So Jane ends up having this moment where she's thinking about her time there. And she says, "It is a happy thing that time quells the longings of vengeance and hushes the promptings of rage and aversion." So I thought this was a really interesting passage because when we first met Jane earlier in the book, she was a very different person. And granted, she was very young. But when she had gone off to school, she meets Helen, and Helen is just, very self-actualized, very mature in her thoughts and everything like that. And Jane keeps being like, "Helen, you should be feeling upset about this. You should be really hung up on this." And Helen keeps being like, "Life's too short. Let's not focus on the bad." So it was just really interesting to me here because this is Jane showing that sense of maturity. She's saying like, okay, time has passed and it has really muted my problems with Mrs. Reed. So that's the first passage I wanted to start with for this week, and I'm curious to see what you all thought of that as well. Alrighty, so Jane ends up getting that summons. She ends up deciding that she's going to go, and there's this whole conversation between her and Mr. Rochester that he's like really trying to hang on to her and have her stay, and she's like, "Nope, I'm going. This is what I need to do. If she has last words, she needs to say to me." And again, it's kind of showing her maturity there too, because she's like, "I want to end things on the right note." So she gets there, and she's being told that Mrs. Reed has to have this conversation with her. And she gets there, and Mrs. Reed is not really very lucid. She's kind of going in and out, and she waits there for days, and then finally she has this conversation with Mrs. Reed. And in the conversation, Mrs. Reed explains that that family member that we heard about earlier in the book that had gone to Madeira had actually reached out and asked about Jane again. So here's what the letter from that relative had said. "Will you have the goodness to send me the address of my niece, Jane Eyre, and to tell me how she is? It is my intention to write shortly and desire her to come to me at Madeira. Providence has blessed my endeavors to secure a competency, and as I am unmarried and childless, I wish to adopt her during my life and bequeath her at my death whatever I may have to leave." So this is a really interesting thing because Jane's whole life, she has really viewed herself as this orphan who really has no money to her name or anything like that. So the fact that suddenly we're in this situation that Jane does in fact have someone that's wanting to give her their wealth is really interesting. But as we find out, Mrs. Reed actually wrote back and said that Jane had died when all of her classmates were dying when she was back at school. So her aunt actually says that she died as well, which is just heinous. But so now her aunt's talking to her on her deathbed, and she says, "You were born, I think, to be my torment. My last hour is racked by the recollection of a deed which, but for you, I should never have been tempted to commit." So I just found that passage really interesting because Mrs. Reed has done this bad thing, this terrible thing, but instead of like on her deathbed taking ownership of what she did, instead she's still blaming Jane. "Oh, Jane, if you never had been born, I never would have done this thing. Like, are you kidding me right now?" So I think that just goes to show again kind of the wide difference between the personality of Jane and then the personality of her aunt, Mrs. Reed, and just how, you know, Jane wasn't raised with the wealth and with the means, but she still has clearly become a better person because she wouldn't think of doing something like that. And then I also found this whole concept interesting because I'm just curious what Jane is going to end up deciding to do if she does become wealthy after all. So more to come on that, but let me know your thoughts on this section as well. Okay, so the next section that I want to talk to you about, or that I want us to talk about together, truth be told, is Jane is now actually returning home to Mr. Rochester and to the home where she lives with Adele and everything after her long stint with her aunt. A couple other things while she was there that were interesting, just the dynamics between her two cousins and how they like completely hate each other. So that was kind of interesting as well. But so Jane is now returning home, and there's this passage where she says, "How people feel when they are returning home from an absence, long or short, I did not know. I had never experienced the sensation." So I think this is really her kind of telling the reader that she's never had a place that she's called home before, which is a really powerful thing to contemplate in general, but it's true. I mean, she was orphaned, she was living with people that didn't even really want her there, and then she goes off to school. That was school. She, you know, had a good time there, but it was still school. And even though this is where she works, she just really feels a sense of belonging there. So then a few pages later, she says, she's talking to Mr. Rochester, and she says that she's glad to be back around him again, and wherever you are is my home, my only home. So really strong moment there. So she goes from saying she's never had that experience of that homecoming feeling, and then she's saying Mr. Rochester is actually her home. So I found that to be a really beautiful sentiment, and really interesting too, because it's almost like she's been lost and kind of going through the world looking for that, searching for that, and then now with Mr. Rochester she has found that. But she also, of course, believes that he's about to be married too, but she's still feeling like she can confide this in him, which I thought was really special. Okay, so something that is really interesting when you actually start reading classics, like me, maybe as an adult, maybe a lot of you have read them younger, but there's that moment that you've kind of heard a quote many times before, and you never had it in context because you didn't read the book before. So that's kind of what I've experienced a little bit with reading Jane Eyre. But one passage or one quote that is really popular that you end up hearing all the time when it comes to Jane Eyre is, "I am no bird and no net ensnarls me. I am a free human being with an independent will." And then in the book it goes on to say, "which I now exert to leave you." So yeah, I've heard that passage a bunch, and it was kind of exciting for me when I got to the passage where I actually got to know the context. So this is just a little while later, and Jane is actually talking to Mr. Rochester, and she's asking, like, "Are you preparing this wedding that I know you were going to be doing to Miss Ingram?" And she's also saying, like, are Adele and I going to leave soon? I know that Miss Ingram wasn't maybe the biggest fan of ours, so if she's going to be moving in soon, we want to be going. And he's talked about, "Oh yeah, I have a place that you can go in Ireland with a family, and you can go there." And then she's like, "Wait, what? That's too far from you." And he's saying the same, like, "I will feel like a physical pain if you're that far from me." So they're both going on like this, but then Jane's like, "Well, if you're marrying her, I have to leave. Like, I can't stay in this situation that both isn't really safe for Adele, isn't going to be optimal for me, and I don't want to be, you know, trapped by watching you be with someone else as well." So just kind of a cool moment to hit that point in the book. But also, since this is such a powerful scene, I am really curious to hear what you all think of it too, so let me know. Okay, so this next one is part of that same conversation that we were just talking about. And Jane is starting to ask, like, what's going on with you and Miss Ingram? Like, what's happening? And Mr. Rochester says, well, I feigned courtship of Miss Ingram because I wished to render you as madly in love with me as I was with you. And I knew jealousy would be the best ally I could call in for the furtherance of that end. So interesting confession there. So the whole time, like, the dynamic between Mr. Rochester and Miss Ingram was super weird, especially when he dressed up and like the fortune teller, and he was kind of like telling her the fortune and then saw her get upset, like super weird. But I didn't necessarily think that he was doing the whole thing just to try to make Jane jealous. So I did find that pretty interesting when that epiphany came out. So yeah, and I mean, this whole time, Jane has truly believed in her heart of hearts that she was dealing with unrequited love. And so the fact that he was also kind of like doing weird things in the background to try to get to her too is really interesting. And maybe if they had just been honest with each other up front, that would have been different, but we also would have lost like 100 pages of this book. So who knows? But let me know what you think as well. Okay, so a passage that I found really interesting as part of this same garden confession one-on-one scene that we've been talking about for most of this week is the fact that Jane brings up her station with Mr. Rochester, and he says, "Station, station, your station is in my heart and on the necks of those who would insult you, now or hereafter, go." So it's been kind of a big theme within the book, this whole concept of Jane not having the same station as those around her because she was orphaned, because of all of this stuff. So the fact that Mr. Rochester is like, are you kidding me right now? Like, I'm in love with you, your station is with me, like, none of that matters to me at all. Like, this is a non-point. I just found it kind of refreshing because in today's day and age, I don't think people care so much about stuff like that, but like, I know this was a different time. So the fact that Mr. Rochester's like, no, we love each other. That's what matters. Like, where you came from has no place here. So I liked that. Let me know if you also caught that as kind of like wrapping up that theme that we've seen throughout the book, or if you thought something else. Let me know. Okay, so this whole scene that we've talked about a lot now, because there were some great quotes and passages as part of it, is nearing to an end. So during that scene, Mr. Rochester ends up proposing to Jane, and she accepts the proposal once she realizes that he's serious. And then life kind of carries on. And he has in his mind that immediately he can kind of like shower her with jewels and dresses and all the things, and that she's just gonna eat it up. And she's like, no to all of that. Also, I want to keep my job as the governess for Adele. Also, I want you to still pay me a salary because I want to be an independent woman with my own money, etc., etc., etc. So all of that was great. And then the other folks in their lives start to kind of see what's happening, and people start to realize that it's real love, and everyone kind of comes on board and they're excited. And they also see that like no one's taking advantage of anyone else. So everyone is on board, everyone's excited. And then this really kind of special moment that happens. Mr. Rochester leaves, and it's the day before the wedding, and he's not home at the normal time that he would get home. And so Jane is getting like really nervous, and she ends up like running out to the street to try to like see his carriage as it's approaching sooner than she would if she stayed home and all this stuff. So then they're back home and they're talking, and this passage ends up happening, that he's trying to get her to stay up with him, and she says, it is near midnight. And then he said, yes, but remember, Jane, you promised to wake with me the night before my wedding. Oh my goodness. I thought that was so cute, because when he had made her promise that earlier, when she thought he was marrying Miss Ingram, I kind of was like, what's this guy's deal? Like, he knows she, like, in my opinion, he knew she liked him, and now he's making her, like, be around him the night before, which is probably heartbreaking for her, but, like, sweet that they care about each other, but heartbreaking nonetheless. And so then the fact that this is how it ended up playing out, that, like, in his mind he was hoping for this end game all along, and so, like, he just was planning for the future a lot. I don't know. I found it really sweet. I really liked that he called back the fact that she had made that promise, and that they ended up kind of, like, staying up together to comfort each other's nerves before their big day. So yeah, that was really how the book ends. The only other thing I want to mention right now, and I know that I have actually messaged with Ani, who's one of the readers for this, but oh my goodness, what is the deal with Grace Poole? I have a lot of questions. Jane has a lot of questions. Jane is being told she won't know for a year and a day after her wedding. Luckily, I'm not Jane, and I will find out sooner. So no idea what the deal is, but I'm very curious. If you already know, please no spoilers, but if you don't know and you want to speculate with me, come right ahead. All right, so that was everything for this week. I hope that you are enjoying it as much as I am. I'm truly loving this book. And yeah, that's it. So I'm excited to read more with you guys. And as you can see, we are really getting there. We only have this much left. Not that much. All right, well, I look forward to talking to you guys more about this next week. Have a great week and happy reading.